Our first session today is called From Pilots to Policy, and I'm extremely excited to have these amazing people here with me on the stage. So I'm going to do some introductions, and then we're going to get into it. So I'll start at the far end. Madeline Nyley is the Director of Guaranteed Income at the Economic Security Project, and she's also co-chair of the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice, which is a coalition of organizations that are doing pilot work and direct cash demonstrations. Economic Security Project challenges the status quo by catalyzing ideas that build economic power for all Americans. They've identified 2 fights that they think they can win to achieve this goal: a guaranteed income that would provide an income floor for all Americans, and then anti-monopoly action to rein in the unprecedented concentration of corporate power. So very excited to have you here, Madeline. And then in the middle, Halah Ahmad is Vice President for PR and Policy Communications at the Jain Family Institute, which is an applied research organization that designs guaranteed income pilots and policy. Halah is an advisor to multiple pilots on communications and policy change. Her areas of expertise include translating research for policy, storytelling, and messaging in the national media space. Welcome, Halah. And then Catherine Kagat. Okay, Kagat. Catherine is the Research and Program Officer for the Mayors for the Guaranteed Income. Catherine holds a PhD in anthropology, and prior to joining MGI, she conducted research on sustainable development and household and community resilience. So let's do a round of applause for the folks that are here. So this first session is called From Pilots to Policy, and each of the speakers up here today, their organizations have been deeply involved in the pilot space and also are thinking more broadly around how do we actually get to federal policy ultimately, and what does that path look like? So we're going to dig into really that piece. And for us, we're starting with this as kind of the keynote plenary, because the rest of this day, there's going to be programming that actually helps build on and go deeper into a lot of the topics and themes that we're going to talk about here. So this is a really great kind of umbrella context-setting conversation for us to dig deeper together. Okay, so the first one I wanted to ask, and this is going to be a little bit more of just kind of a conversation, a roundtable. So I hope that everybody feels like comfortable to take the conversation wherever it makes the most sense. But I also have some questions to make sure that we can fill in and make sure we cover kind of the core pieces. Okay, so each of your organizations have included pilots in the very early stages of your work. So I would love to just understand why pilots were seen as such a kind of critical place to start, and ultimately, like, what was that vision or goal as you started to support that? And maybe let's start with you, Madeline.
Sure. So thank you so much for having me. Am I on? Am I on now? Great. Thank you so much for having me, and everyone for showing up online. I know Zoom fatigue is real, and I would suggest, if you haven't already, hide your own self. You don't need to look at what you look like. You look fabulous. Just focus on the conference. And for folks who are in person, thank you so much for coming out and joining us today. So Economic Security Project was started almost about 6 years ago, and at the time, there were no pilots in the US. We had done some experiments earlier with the income maintenance experiments of the 60s and 70s that some of you are likely very familiar with, but the conversation had sputtered. And so ESP was started by our 3 co-chairs, Dorian Warren, Natalie Foster, and Chris Hughes, to bring this back into a conversation, to recognize that some voices were sparking again, but it really wasn't in the national imagination, as Stacey was talking about. And we recognized that we needed to make a big bet. We needed to do something to really get this on the ground and have people see it. So we partnered with Mayor Michael Tubbs in Stockton, and we're the first and largest funder of the Stockton Economic Empowerment Demonstration, which provided, as I'm sure most of you know, $500 a month to 125 Stocktonians. It was initially envisioned as an 18-month program, but would have ended during what we thought was the height of COVID. Who knows when that point is, or if we've already passed it, I don't know. So it was extended for 24 months. And we, this was a randomized control trial, which is really the gold standard of social science research. This was a way of taking a bet to see what would happen. And now we can look back and say, oh, what a great idea that was. And we have so much lovely data and it was so fantastic. But it really was a risk, right, for Mayor Tubbs, for ESP, to really put their money where the mouth was and say, what happens? We believe that giving people economic stability increases their ability to live full, robust lives. Let's see what happens. So we thought that was really important. And equally, we have long partnered with and supported Aisha Yandaro, who is my co-chair on the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice in Jackson, Mississippi. And her pilot or demonstration, the Magnolia Mothers Trust, is now on its 4th cohort. So the first year, launched around the same time as SEED, was only 30 moms. But it was super unique in that it was, at the time, the qualification required being a single parent, but that's since changed because relationships are complicated, right? So how do we define that? So it was 30 single Black moms living in subsidized housing in Jackson, Mississippi. And this work was not a randomized control trial, but was directly challenging these century-old sexist and racist ideas of deservedness, of value, of worth. So I think that these were 2 ways in which we really went big in the field to say, what happens when you trust people? What happens when you give people a little economic cushion and safety and security to dream and build? So the Magnolia Mothers Trust is now on its 4th cohort, 100 moms each year since the first year. And they do have evaluation data and information available. Again, it's not a randomized control trial, but I think as we'll talk about, and Catherine and others and Halah, who are much more deeply embedded in the research side of things than I am, can share that there are a lot of ways that we can understand what's happening through these different demonstrations.
Well, that's a nice segue. How about, do you guys want to hop in and chat a little bit more about your organization?
Sure.
Evolution?
I can go next. I don't know if this is working. Yeah, okay. I can go next and kind of feed off what Madeline was just speaking about, because Mayors for Guaranteed Income really owes its beginnings to SEED and the work that was pioneered by Mayor Michael Tubbs and championed by Mayor Michael Tubbs when he was the mayor of Stockton. And really the goal for SEED was to provide unconditional cash assistance and find a new way to address poverty. And to make unconditional cash assistance really sit alongside other social safety net benefits. And that's really key, right? So instead of replacing it, making it complement social safety net policies. And Stockton, again, as Madeline just alluded to, it was the first mayor-led pilot, so they were really taking a chance. And from their Mayors for Guaranteed Income stemmed from that work in terms of other mayors that were willing to take a chance to address poverty in a kind of new way. And also, the vision for SEED and really the vision for the other pilots within the MGI coalition is to provide an initiative that really acknowledges people's agency and their self-determination and in order to provide financial security and also trusting people to manage their resources and understanding that people manage their resources in the way that they feel best for themselves and also for their households. So our work in the way that we support cities comes from SEED and their work in like benefits protection, the research and evaluation component of SEED, and also the narrative work that SEED did in terms of having a storytelling cohort. And we think that those components are really important to really make a case for broader guaranteed income policies.
I would say for the Jain Family Institute, JFI, we came in sort of in a similar position to ESP early on with the Stockton demonstration. We were really excited to see the interest of Mayor Tubbs and Stockton in producing not a pilot, but a demonstration of cash assistance, because from our position as social science researchers, we found guaranteed income to be a promising idea. There was existing research, there was existing precedent of taking a look at what does cash assistance do to poverty. Well, when you give people cash, it tends to help, with the poverty issue. It tends to help with a lot of other, outcome areas. But there were some remaining questions, and especially in the debate in the United States, there was less, of the demonstration points for unconditional, no strings attached cash in the United States. So Stockton was a really important first go to open the conversation, take that risk with a first research project. And our involvement, in that effort was really to sort of define what are the open research questions, which continues to be our biggest focus when it comes to pilot work in the United States. We think that guaranteed income and cash assistance has been tested around the world, which it has been, and there's a lot of evidence already for, cash assistance as part of a broader social safety net policy. But there are remaining questions. We want to define a little bit more closely what it means to give someone a guaranteed income. How can you deliver it more effectively, and then incorporate that into recommendations for policy design? And I think that's part of what we're going to talk about today in terms of transitioning lessons from the pilots to policy. But I think the other piece of it, which was sort of at the same time as Stockton, is building out not just pilots, but starting in conversations with cities in task forces. So ESP and JFI were involved in task forces in Chicago, in Newark, in Atlanta. And the importance of the task forces was essentially to incorporate conversations with community-based organizations, community members, the varieties of governance systems within the city, all of the different politics and folks involved, and to say, can we offer this idea that cash assistance might be a radical and a hugely impactful policy to add to the mix of what you all are attempting to do here, but let's not just come at it as a broad idea from us. Let's think about a needs assessment that comes from you all. Let's hear about where the safety net is not working at a local level for all of you, and how are the problems that you all are talking about linked and might be solved for by a simpler, more direct solution to help individuals and give them the agency to help themselves. So those conversations, I think, created a precedent for what it means to inform policy and research directly from conversations with community, and in the same way, at the same time that you're building research, at the same time that you're building policy, you're creating the networks that have the buy-in to make it succeed. So I think that piece of it also continues to be really important in the pilots, and that was another aspect of building the case for the pilots that came after.
Nice. I love you brought up all of you guys as you were talking. There were a couple of things that came to mind. The task forces as a space for really bringing together and acknowledging the intersectionality of economic justice work with so many other, different areas of work on the ground that organizations are doing, often very hyper locally. And we do have a whole session tomorrow, a plenary, that's going to be talking about intersectionality. So that's going to be a great opportunity to dig some deeper into what does that actually mean, and what are the role that pilots can play to help support bringing new people into the conversation around direct cash. So it's awesome. As you guys were talking also, within the basic income community, I'm sure a lot of the people in the audience have heard this. If they're kind of deeper involved in having conversations with other folks who are knowledgeable, often a question comes up that, do we actually need more pilots? Is this really necessary? So I'd love to hear what your guys' thoughts are on, do we need more pilots? And if so, or if not, kind of why? What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I guess I can go first. I think they still play a very valuable part in helping us understand, particularly what Halah was saying about how do you administer something like this. When I think the great failure, the thing that we didn't do with the social safety net policies, of course, it was a different time when those things were established. We didn't hear from community members that were impacted by these social safety net policies. But now we have a real chance to learn, exactly how are people experiencing guaranteed income, and to understand the nuances of that, in the way that can inform how we will administer it when it does become, I'm going to be very positive and say when it becomes a broader national policy. And I think that's a real great opportunity, particularly when now we have pilots that are publicly funded, where cities are actually showing like this is viable. We can manage administering something like this. So the lessons that we learn from that as pilots get publicly funded and they expand in scale is really important, because then we can shape the way that we do implement this when we do have the policy in the way that we didn't get to for Medicare or for housing. And then also, I think, just in terms of like still understanding the inequities within guaranteed income, like what populations are we neglecting or maybe excluding by administering it in this way or that way. I think that's still really important. At the moment, many pilots are smaller in sample size, so we aren't able to kind of get at like the subgroups, but as pilots grow in scale, then that can be kind of more examined and analyzed. But yeah, and also the other thing is like, the larger pilots that we have, and I keep thinking like larger in scale, which is important because we should, we want to know also how guaranteed income affects communities. At the moment, we just know how it affects households. But I think to reinforce the need for it to be a broader policy, you kind of have to show, well, how is it impacting communities? What are the effects, for example, on housing stability on a community level or on local economy?
Yeah, I would agree that there's value to pilots still, but I think there's two important considerations. One, pilots need to vary their design parameters. We need to be more specific about the research questions that we're getting at. And I think one of the institutions that's helped with that and coordinating across pilots is the Guaranteed Income Community of Practice. There's been a lot of conversations and toolkits and things like that JFI and others have produced that try to lay out, okay, here's what we know. We can review the literature, here's what we know, here's what we still don't know. And some of those questions are around, what is the right frequency? We know that people, especially if it's sort of an income smoothing, thinking about your monthly bills, people prefer monthly checks. We know that people prefer that. We don't know what the difference is in terms of the broader, sort of outcome areas. If you vary, biweekly, monthly, every 3 months, lump sums, some of those questions we could get a lot better detail on. And that matters for policy design. It matters for the way that we administer the policy. Another one is the ideal amounts. I mean, I think that we really want to meet folks' basic needs. That's how we see basic income at JFI. But I think, when it comes to you're drawing up a budget and you want to appropriate funds for guaranteed income, it matters whether it's $750 or $1,000, because, and if the effects are dramatically different at a certain cutoff point, we want to know that. And so we need pilots to vary some of these parameters in order to find and get a better sense of that. So those are some of the questions. There are questions that are only answered by large-scale pilots. So, price effects. One of the pilots that we're really excited about, although an international example, is it's not a pilot, actually, it's a policy. The Renda Basica, the basic income program ongoing in Maricá, Brazil. At the moment, we're partnered with a university down in Maricá to study the effects of a 42,000 person basic income that's ongoing. It's been ongoing. And that's a third of the population. And the other cool thing about that is it's administered through a local currency. So the first point of use of the money that's given has to be in the local community. So you can see that the effects would be much more easily observable within that context at a sort of at scale. And we need pilots like that in the United States. I mean, the Chicago pilot that's launching is a really amazing example of that, where we see room. But then the second piece that I would say for pilots is, look, pilots take a lot of money and a lot of effort to put on, as a lot of people listening or in this room will know. And one of the things that gets sidelined when you're so focused on the practical details of getting money out the door and putting on this whole operation is the narrative and the storytelling piece, which I think MGI has been really conscientious of, and trying to encourage folks to really focus on their storytelling cohorts. If they can't get a larger pilot, focus on the qualitative data. And that's really important. I think one of the things that income movement's doing really well is working with pilots to move beyond just the focus on getting the money out the door, which is obviously super important, step one, but also create an apparatus where you're engaging with community, you're doing political education so that when the pilot's over, the movement continues. There's a base to work from to move forward from policy, and I think towards policy. So I think that's the piece that I would say about pilots. We need to be careful that we're not expending all of our limited resources on just getting it out the door without laying the groundwork for a longer term policy. And to your point, I think we want to know what the effects of the pilot and the pilot's messaging are, not just on the recipients, but on the wider community. How are conversations changing in the city? What research plans include a look at the way the conversation and narrative is changing in the wider city? I think Chicago is a great opportunity for that, and we have spoken with them and advised a lot of folks on this question. So I know pilots are thinking about it, but it's definitely a key issue to keep considering.
I'm not a researcher. I'm an advocate. So I think I come at this differently. I'm like, okay, cool, we already know. But I totally hear and respect that there are these outstanding questions. I can't speak to them in the way that Halah and Catherine do so eloquently. So I look at what is the purpose of the demonstrations. One, most importantly, get money into people's pockets. If this is how philanthropy wants to show up, if we have buckets of money from the American Rescue Plan, I can't think of a better way to do that than to give it to people who don't have enough cash right now. Two, we are building constituencies. And again, as Halah noted, income movement is doing this really powerful work to engage with the demonstrations to ensure that those constituencies, those folks who are receiving cash, who are seeing their neighborhoods become more rich in abundance, not just rich in cash, but in the freedom and the abundance, to really tap into that and build towards policy, right? I was speaking recently with somebody and we were talking about how we've all walked through neighborhoods that are in lack, that are struggling, and we've all walked through neighborhoods that have abundance. And like, where do you want to walk through? Where do you want to live? What do you want? You want that abundance. So how do we capture that and translate that into political will? We're building champions. So either through the mayors that work with MGI or the local leaders in nonprofits and other spaces, they become champions of cash when they see it show up for their neighbors. And then finally, the narrative piece cannot be understated, right? How we can shift our understanding of what it takes to build abundance for our fellow community members, what it takes and what that means, right? And this mindset of like, if we give people money, we create this opportunity for the individual, for the community, and for society writ large. And I've just had so many things spark in this conversation. So cut me off if I should be.
No, keep going.
Okay, so thinking about the Chicago task force, they actually weren't able to get a demonstration going at the time, but they created this really strong working group that shifted the earned income credit. They call it not the earned income tax credit, they just left out the T there, at the state level to expand it to ITIN filers. So their immigrant community was included. They've made all these changes that are shifting policy that I think we can trace back to getting folks together to talk about cash. And then when the American Rescue Plan money came down, we saw Chicago and Cook County really step up and launch these very large demonstrations. And then also thinking about the Atlanta task force, it was so amazing to see the community come together in the old Fourth Ward of Atlanta, where Martin Luther King Jr. was born and started preaching, and say, this is a rapidly gentrifying area. And the reason people want to be here is because of the backbone of this community, which are Black women. And they are the ones that will be pushed out as this neighborhood gentrifies. So what do we need to do? We need to keep them here. The reason this neighborhood is the neighborhood you want to live in are these women, and we will support them. And so I just love that it was so directive and so thoughtful about what makes our neighborhoods robust and wonderful, and how do we support the communities to ensure that that continues?
Nice. So you guys touched on so many of the goals, and I just want to go back and like state them for everybody so that that are the most consistent goals that pilots seem to be working towards and organizations who are supporting that work. And then I want to just get a sense from you guys, you know, which of those goals do you feel like in the next 12, 24, 36 months we should really be spending additional time? And you started to touch on this, but maybe we can go a little bit deeper. So the first goal is get people money. Absolutely, and walk the talk, and just, you know, as much as we can, try to alleviate, you know, what we know is a significant issue and is an economic and social justice issue as quickly as possible. And if that means while we're trying to get to policy, we can do it for hundreds or thousands of people in communities, let's do it. The second is helping build towards policy. And the two, I think a lot of the time, specifically like defining policy, and there's the proof point of the data, right? It's a valid, solid potential policy to alleviate and address poverty. And I think that most of the time when I'm seeing the conversation about pilots, like in the media and in the more kind of national space, around pilots in particular, it seems to be the focus of that, like proving that basic income works. We saw it with the child tax credit also. The data that's coming out immediately about the child tax credit is, did it actually help people? And how much did it help people? And is it worth the price tag based on like the actual impact? But then there's also the pipelines, the understanding of like the actual nitty-gritty details of policy, how you implement it, how you get the money, as that kind of second piece of the policy side of things. And how do you make sure that you're not leaving people, just exactly like what Catherine, you were talking about, how do you not leave people behind, but make sure that the most vulnerable, you know, those that are most outside of the system have been pushed to the margins are able to receive it. But then there's also this piece around impact of growing the community, more and more people getting on board with that. And there's kind of two pieces to that. There's the grassroots and coalition, like task forces and organizations and individuals coming together. And then there's the narrative work. How do we start to unpack and ultimately dismantle so many of the harmful narratives around people that are living in poverty, whether it's this idea that we live in a meritocracy, so if you're poor, it's because you are lazy and you don't deserve it and you make bad choices, or kind of a pretty broad range of myths that are out there, and shifting that. So if we think about those kind of bigger areas, obviously giving cash to people is a pretty straightforward one, but when we get into the policy side of proving it, proving that it's like impactful and worth it, and then how to design it, and then on the growing the community side, the grassroots kind of advocacy side versus, and then the narrative side, what areas do you feel like we've been too light on that we need to get much deeper into as we move forward over the next few years?
I guess I could start. So one of the things first of all of these topics, such great starting points for all of the different sessions in this conference. So I recommend people checking them all out because there's a lot of expertise, brought to these sessions. But to focus on the where do we need to focus more? Pilots and convenings of practitioners and task forces are a really fantastic starting point, and they've been, getting us going. But I would say that we need to move in our conversations with pilot practitioners and through our assessment of the sort of policy environment, our work with legislators. We need to move from this sort of grass tops approach, I would characterize it, to much more deep grassroots organizing work. I don't sit in the advocacy space. I sit sort of adjacent to the advocacy space at JFI as a policy communications expert and working to bring research to policymakers and bring research to grassroots and have the pipelines back and forth. But what we're seeing is that, we know that research only can go so far to tell a story. And in fact, it doesn't go very far at all sometimes. Storytelling is super important, and storytelling on a regular basis and at scale is the work of grassroots organizing. And I think it's not happening enough. It's not getting enough attention, and it's definitely something that also just requires more resources. Mm-hmm. And it's a long game. I think that, from researchers to practitioners to policymakers to funders, we need to be in it for the long haul, because the arc of policy change for an issue like this one, which requires massive public investment and will require a lot of narrative change, is long. It's not going to take 2 years for us to implement. We're not going to, even with the child tax credit, the history of the child tax credit and cash assistance in the United States shows us that, there might be the research there for a long, long time before it's implemented. Yeah. 10 years ago, researchers were talking about the importance of the child allowance, all the evidence that was emerging from European countries that have implemented it at scale for a long time, the long-term effects of that kind of a credit on conditional cash. We had, a child allowance in the United States in the 20th century, and after, welfare reform in the 90s and all these, frankly, racist tropes about who was benefiting from these cash assistance programs, they curtailed them. And so we can see that there's sort of a long arc where storytelling plays such an essential role when it comes to policy change. So that's where we need to dedicate our efforts a lot more. And we could talk a lot more about the specifics of narrative work, but I'll stop there, and I hope we get to that.
So we recently released, I guess it's pronounced primer, funder primer with Asset Funders Network and Springboard to Opportunities that really talks about where do we need to invest. And so it's very clear, invest in the demonstrations, like fund money going out the door, invest in research, fund the research apparatus that is supporting this, invest in advocacy, which is the narrative change, and invest in movement building. And I would really say that it's those last two that's where I sit. And I think that, on the call with funders, I was like, also we need C4 dollars, right? So that's something too, is we need to build the political arm of this, and we need to invest in movement building. So I know, again, Income Movement is doing this amazing deep work. How well funded and how much are we invested in growing this? It's amazing that there's 400 folks here, but there's 400 folks here, right? Like, how do we get this message out and engage communities to grow it more organically within? So I think that there's a lot that we need to do. I think that there is a very specific way we can expand in states using the child tax credit and earned income tax credit. I don't know if I should jump into that now or wait. So, really, what is a policy? How do we get from demonstration to policy? We're seeing that happen. We're seeing that child tax credits and earned income tax credits on the state level are being expanded in ways that will function like a basic income. They will be more generous. So DC expanded, so they're going to match the federal up to 100%. They will be more inclusive. We will ensure that our neighbors who are immigrants are included through making sure I-10 filers and mixed status households are able to receive the benefits. They will be made monthly. So as Halah was talking about, we have some data that Columbia just put out that found that the child tax credits that were paid out monthly smoothed poverty for those families at the same cost as an annual lump sum. So when we do the annual lump sum child tax credit, there is an immediate reduction in poverty for that time, and then it dips back down. When we do the monthly payments, there was a smoothing so that there weren't those dips. And then finally, we will make it so that there's no earned income required to receive it. And so Vermont just passed a child tax credit that does not require that the caregiver have earned income. And California's young child tax credit requires $1 of earning, which, okay, that just seems like an administrative cluster, but I guess you have your reasons. So if we implement all of these things, then we actually have these credits that function as basic income on the state level, and we're seeing it happen on the state level. We should not be giving up the fight on the federal level. ESP is deeply involved with getting those American Rescue Plan expansions of the child tax credit codified and to keep them, but we're definitely seeing right now that there's space on the state level and that there's great work. So this is also where I think we need to invest. We need to bring the learnings from the demonstrations and the folks who are, really committed to cash together with state policy advocates and others to scale up from what tend to be, hyper local up to the state level.
Yeah, I think, sorry, excuse me. I think in terms of expansion, I know we say that, get the money out there, and that's kind of, demonstrations are key. But I also think it needs to be really purposeful. I mean, at the moment, demonstrations are temporary and they're kind of in a lottery system. But I think there is a move now, especially with public dollars and being able to scale up the sample size for these pilots, is that there's a move to actually make it operate more like a policy. So Cambridge is doing this thing where they set a criteria, and anybody who fits that criteria is going to get guaranteed income. And I think that's where we need to move towards. Or like Cook Counties is, starting a guaranteed income, but wanting to make it a permanent one. Because then it starts to act more like a policy, right? And when you give people that kind of right, and other people see like, oh, they're doing that, like I want something like that, it makes it harder to regress and take away. I mean, that's kind of what we saw with the Obamacare. They tried to kill Obamacare like 3 times. But again, and this is narrative work, right? It's grassroots level work. When you start to kind of like, it's inception. When you kind of put that in people's head that this is something that you deserve, it's a right that you should have, then of course they're going to fight for that, and they're going to advocate for that to kind of their political leaders, right? So yeah, I think that's something that we need to move towards to in terms of like making it more like, at the moment it's like at the city level policy, but that's kind of the build up to something broader. Yeah. And sorry. And also in terms of like the infrastructure around guaranteed income, I know we're talking a lot about like the actual disbursements of unconditional cash, but also we have to think about policies around social safety net and thinking about like benefits protection, because what I was speaking about earlier about some people getting left out, a lot of that is because they have benefits that are impacted by guaranteed income. So not only should we be advocating for, guaranteed income, we should also be advocating for changing the way that our social safety net works alongside guaranteed income. And some cities have been, or some states have been doing that in terms of like advocating for policies that exempts guaranteed income payments from certain benefits, but more needs to be done for kind of, benefits that are administered at a federal level, like the SSI or, housing assistance. But yeah, just creating an infrastructure so that guaranteed income can sit alongside social safety nets, and we're not kind of having one and threatening the other. So.
Well, and here, I think it's a good opportunity for us to be very explicit about this. I'd love to hear your guys' perspective. When it comes to some of the conversations at the federal level, there starts to be conversations about should this replace or should this sit alongside and support the existing social safety net. So I just want to get a sense from you. I think you started to hit on that, Catherine. I think I get a sense of where you are, but it is definitely something that becomes, as we move towards policy, it's often is like the first thing when there's talk about budgets. Well, can we just take all this money and then push it into this space and do it as direct cash? So as we start to talk about policy and taking this work from pilots into the policy space, what are your guys' thoughts and your organization's thoughts on that idea?
Well, I guess I started speaking about it. So yeah. Yeah, we are vehemently against kind of like sister. Yeah, just because there are certain benefits and kind of security, kind of blanket type services that really the government can best handle, because it's just like cash isn't going to solve. It's just too, like healthcare is too costly for just $1,000 a month to cover healthcare, and the same thing with housing assistance. And the whole point of really guaranteed income is it gives you flexibility to use that because there isn't a kind of benefit program that is going to pay your car bills if you need like a new tire. That's not something that the government can handle, right? Like that's kind of something that you're best equipped to do on your own kind of time with your resources. But there are just certain services that are just too big to for somebody to navigate on their own with cash, and that cash won't even cover if we're talking about kind of income floor, a type of amount of cash, it's just not going to cover. And I think that that's why there's still a need for those services rather than kind of like dissolving them just to get people guaranteed income.
I would say, in short form, retweet. JFI is pretty clear that the research does not support taking away all sorts of public benefits and then replacing them with cash. And part of that is that, there are a wide variety of social safety net programs that serve different purposes than cash can serve directly. And also, particularly as an immediate term change, it would be damaging for a lot of folks to, pull the rug out from under them and then hand them a wad of cash to figure out, now their Section 8 housing and whatever it may be. Are there programs that you probably could redirect funds from? Yeah, I would say maybe, there's an overemphasis on, in the financial inclusion world, there's an overemphasis on financial literacy training, and then a bunch of resources get dedicated to that, but the evidence is not as strong for that kind of policy intervention as it is for just giving people money. In fact, actually, poor people know how to spend their money. They are very careful about how to spend their money. So there are places where there's policies that are either clunky or administratively burdensome, where guaranteed income can smooth that out and be a much more appropriate policy intervention. But in terms of the benefit system writ large, we definitely don't see cash assistance as a replacement for all of those benefits.
ESP really believes in strong government. And I think, so I just wrote with my, the anti-monopoly director, Becky, and I just wrote a piece looking at the formula crisis right now. And it is both a failure of markets and a failure of cash, right? So there was concentration in formulas, the market. And so when one facility went offline, there was a lack of formula. Now, WIC recipients, the state will bargain to get a reduced price, which I'm a fan of, but it also meant that WIC recipients in many states were limited to purchasing one brand of formula. So if your kid doesn't like that, kids are like stupidly stubborn about food, right? You didn't have opportunity. So when this crisis hit and suddenly shelves were bare, it both impacted WIC recipients who potentially couldn't buy what formula was available if something was available, and it impacted people who had cash because you can't buy something that's not there. So we need strong markets that have regulation and that the government is putting those guardrails up, and we need to make sure that people have cash. Cash gives us options. Options don't matter if there's not formula on the shelves. So I think that we really see this as kind of just plussing everything that was already said.
It's definitely something, it's come up in a lot of conversations on the grassroots side, and as we work more with smaller local organizations and are having conversations, many of whom are who are providing the services, whether it's wraparound services or providing support for a lot of programs that are part of the social safety net. But in some ways, the hope would be that if we have a basic income in place, that it starts to influence our social safety net. Like some of the ideas around, like, is it punitive? Is it, is it putting more of a burden on? Is it too many hoops that people have to jump through? Or maybe that housing subsidy could just be cash, and it's just cash that they get to use. It's still the $300 that they would get as a voucher, or whatever it might be. But in some ways, it feels like that might be the hope, is that if we can get this passed, that it's not replacing those things, it's just helping those existing programs become better and learn from kind of the value of what's coming out of the basic income program. Awesome. I did want to, as you guys were talking, I also just wanted to note we'll go get deeper into the policy spot. And maybe this is a good way to get into like getting deeper into policy. As you guys were talking a few minutes ago around this idea of grassroots and community and getting more people kind of active and engaged and really pushing their elected officials. It was actually last year's conference. We were talking with Evelyn Forget, who is an amazing researcher up in Canada, and Canada has had a broad range of pilots with pretty significant numbers historically, and she had gone through a lot of the data from it and from one of the programs. And at a certain point, you know, it was her and other folks who are doing deep in research here in the US, and she was like, the reality is data is limited. Like data, one, often doesn't move hearts and minds of people, and you know, so that narrative work can help to bolster, like you have quant data and then like what does this actually mean on the ground for individuals. But that piece of getting people active and putting pressure on their elected officials and having more elected officials feel comfortable to dip their toe in the water and say, okay, I'm ready to support this thing publicly, like Mayors for a Guaranteed Income does, like just at the very most basic level, having elected officials that other elected officials can look to and say like, oh, they didn't get skewered. They are trying to do something different and innovative. And I'm a member of Congress and that city is in my district. Maybe I should start thinking about this, you know, is a really kind of interesting way to think about grassroots, coalition, like what these pilots can do to help nurture kind of all aspects of movement building that leads to policy. So I'd love to understand, like, what is your guys's or your organization's visions for getting to policy? What are the most key critical steps, maybe near term, because obviously the next 24 to 36 months will be pretty important because most of the pilots, that at least those 90 that we know about now, most of those will have run their course and be in the kind of reporting stage, analyzing the data. But when you're thinking near term, but then also long term, what is your guys' roadmap to policy?
So I think I laid out our state policy program, and so my colleague Pedro is leading that, and we worked with the Shriver Center on Poverty Law to release a roadmap that I think will be really helpful, expanding again the tax credits to function as a guaranteed income. I mean, I don't even know COVID time, but at some point we were like, oh, we're gonna get the CTC, and that's like, then we have a guaranteed income for families with children, and then we'll just move to guaranteed income, and it all seemed to make so much sense. And I forgot for a moment, as Halah pointed out, like, no, this is a decades-long fight. Like, yeah. So that was cute. But so we're deeply engaged in the state level work. I do believe that we need marker legislation on the federal level, something to align folks behind. I have big visions of launching it similar to a Green New Deal that has something that we can coalesce around while recognizing it is a long-term fight. And then as the research and information comes out from the various pilots telling that story, and again, I think ESP can really help in a bit of a bird's eye view with the guaranteed income community of practice. How do we all level up? And so we'll be launching a communications support for the guaranteed income community of practice, recognizing that so many of the different demonstrations can work together. So it is larger than the sum of each of the parts and telling a larger narrative about what this means. So we got a plan. I think we'll get there. One of the things I'll be speaking on tomorrow is guaranteed income and worker power. And like Catherine said, we often think about this as what it means for the individual. And I'm so interested in what it means for the collective. What does guaranteed income do? It gives us space to take risks. And that can be hugely important for shifting power between workers and corporations. And so what does it mean to level up? It means like having this conversation with folks who maybe this isn't their entry point, right? So worker power is. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about raising the floor on which the bargaining table sits. Maybe your entry point is public health. So our cash as care work is really about what does cash mean for health, not to replace insurance, but to create space for health. And so one of the really interesting things from the Stockton demo was that many people were more likely to be employed full-time after the first year But if you looked at the gender breakdown, that was men, because $500 a month is not enough to cover childcare costs. And so what did women do? They took care of longstanding health needs. They went and got that mammogram that they had put off, or they bought sanitary napkins in sufficient supply for the first time in their lives. So let's use these other entry points to build out the conversation. I have grand plans for, who is out there legitimizing this, who is on their bully pulpit preaching about what they care about and how cash helps that, right? Because it is an individual, unique way of supporting so many shared issues. And so I just really think that the conversation needs to continue expanding and bringing people in and being in coalition and being in community with folks whose entry point is slightly different.
Yeah. I would say that at the federal level, certainly the conversation about the child tax credit expansion is not over yet. We're still in it. And we'll see more of that towards the end of this year. There's all of the state level expansions that are popping up. We mentioned Vermont, Maryland, DC, state level expansions of either CTC or EITC. So as the Schreiber Center report says, states are leading the way to some extent. And then we're seeing some policy implementations at city levels through a lot of the pilot work and MGI leading the way. Beyond the policy landscape directly, one of the things that we emphasize, and it's a big emphasis of an upcoming paper that should be released next week from myself and my colleague Steve Nunez, and with a contribution from Saru Jayaraman of One Fair Wage, is that there are a lot of lessons we can take from the past couple of years. Did public opinion shift on guaranteed income or basic income writ large because of the stimulus checks, because of the child tax credit, because of all the pilots? We can say that it shifted to some degree. We don't know how much precisely. And we would argue that the lessons from other movements for expanded social policy or policy change writ large for economic security, such as the movement for tipped and restaurant workers that One Fair Wage is a great example of, we draw on some of those movements for lessons in how do you figure out the long arc of policy change when you've already moved public opinion. So guaranteed income, the Mayors for Guaranteed Income and Data for Progress released a poll that said 61% of the public supported the child tax credit expansion, 56% supported extending that expansion indefinitely. But why does that not move the needle? So what we discuss in this paper that I recommend you all read, just plug in over there. But one of the things that we discuss is guaranteed income is not alone in this question of how do you move not just public opinion of likely voters, but you move constituents so that this is their issue. And that's a really big question of narrative change. And I think we need to be a lot more careful about what we mean by narrative change. When we talk about guaranteed income from all different angles, we can talk about it as empowering for workers. We can talk about it as empowering for moms. We can talk about it as really an intervention for racial equity. But we need to understand that the way that we design policy and the way that we talk about it has to be nuanced because we don't want to reinforce cynical narratives along the way. If we don't believe that this should be work conditioned, then we need to make sure that that doesn't show up in our language. We need to make sure that that doesn't show up in the implication that we're giving. I really believe in the argument about moms, compensating for care work in the broad sense, but I don't really, I would say that we don't need to make their work the condition for their guaranteed income, and I think we're aligned on that. But I think we just need to be careful about the narratives and the frames that we're using. The last thing I'll say is I really think on narrative change, there's a lot of really great work. MGI has a great resource on this, that all guaranteed income work is narrative work. Rashad Robinson has great work on this from Color of Change, and Ann Price from Insight Center, who I think we'll hear from Insight Center in this conference. Ann Price says, regarding the racial wealth gap, don't fixate on the racial wealth gap, focus on undoing its root causes. And understand that the institutions and the policy designs that you create and are advocating for, they themselves reinforce ideas about the policy. So if you're advocating for an income tested program, you're telling people something about the kind of support that they deserve. It's conditional on their income. They have to have $1 of income first, even if it's just $1. Whatever it may be, I think we just need to be careful in this narrative work and be really aligned as a broader movement in what sort of framing are we reinforcing? Because we can argue with people about deservedness, or we can reinforce a broader vision for what it looks like when people have what they need to thrive. And I think the latter draws from the lessons of lots of progressive movements, and I would recommend folks really be conscientious of that in their work.
Yeah, and just to add to what Halah is saying in terms of the framing, I mean, yeah, that's absolutely key in terms of, guaranteed income is narrative work. How you design your program actually frames the kind of ideas that you're putting out there. So, when a pilot chooses to do a guaranteed income for returning citizens, they're saying something about what returning citizens deserve, right? And they're kind of undoing whatever misconceptions we have about, the experiences of returning citizens. And also, they're not just changing narrative. They're not just changing narratives around guaranteed income. They're changing narratives about the justice system in the U.S., right? So that's totally key in terms of how you frame your pilot. And the other thing is you're absolutely right in that research and data can only go so far. You can only appeal to people's pragmatism at some point, but then at some point you're going to have to kind of existentially change people, right? And change the way that they view the world. I mean, we saw that with the CTC, right? I mean, the data showed that child poverty decreased from 16% to 11%. We saw with data that actually unemployment didn't go up. With parents, unemployment went down because they were able to find childcare, so they didn't have to miss work. And yet these unproductive tropes and unproductive narratives about people are going to work less and they're still there, right? So obviously you need narrative to reinforce policy, because policy is super fragile. I mean, we're seeing that this year, not just with the CTC dying, but with reproductive rights dying, with democracy. But yeah, I mean, there is hope in terms of how you can use narrative to reinforce policies, right? And to humanize people's experience so that other people can see themselves in others, really, so that they're advocating for certain changes.
And later today, the last session of today will be going much deeper into the narrative work side of things. So I think really exciting opportunity to take this broader conversation, what's the broader themes and vision, but then also getting very deep into the practical, how do you actually do that work? And because it is complex work, for sure. And we see it when we have conversations with our neighbors and they're like, what are you interested in or whatever? And you start to talk about it and they're like, what about this? And it's just instantly barriers go up and how you have that conversation. But then we also see it with, Senator Manchin and people who have a lot of power that get to make a decision. And then they consistently go to those tropes or those false, racist, misogynist ideas around I don't want to give money to parents because they're going to use it for drugs. Those kinds of pieces, they're going to drop out of the workforce, whatever it is. So really excited. Hopefully everybody's able to attend that session because I think there's going to be just so much to dig into there. And we actually have, for the folks that are here in person in Portland, we actually have a first screening of a film, a sneak peek at a film that actually that goes deep into Ruby Duncan and the National Welfare Rights Organization kind of creation and the work that Black women were doing in the 60s and 70s to actually get basic income in that era onto the national stage. So we'll be able to, and she was very actively fighting against the welfare queen tropes and some of those things. So we're gonna have a lot of opportunities to kind of dig deeper into that and later today, which is very exciting. I think we're coming, we've got about 20 minutes, so we wanna make sure we have time for questions. And I know that Kimberly is somewhere, maybe. Oh, Chelsea. Okay, great. Chelsea, Chelsea's going to be bringing questions from the live stream here to the audience, but also if you guys have questions, just go ahead and walk up to the mic and stand in line or just wait, whatever you want to do. And we'll start taking those questions. You want to start with one, Chelsea? You have to turn the mic on.
I don't know if we're gonna
Flip the little switch.
I did. Oh, okay. I have a question from Olaf to Catherine. What chances do you see to expand MGI from US only to global network?
So I don't make that decision. But lately there have been actually talks within MGI to not just do mayors for guaranteed income, but also kind of pull in counties as well, because counties are also doing a lot of work, and that also just expands the scale of guaranteed income, particularly if there's public funding involved. But at the moment, I'm not sure about the trajectory to make it more global. But again, inception, right? If you put it out there, maybe, you put the idea out there. But yeah, so apologies for not having a straightforward answer on that.
There will be there's a session on Saturday, a virtual session with some folks from Europe, including some mayors who are there doing some work in the space and really trying to think about how to take MGI's kind of model here in the US and start to expand it. So we will get a chance to hear a little bit more about that.
I will say also, I'm on a podcast with a Welsh organization.
Yeah.
And so if anyone knows what's going on in Wales, like I need to learn quickly. But I think there are these conversations sparking with what we can learn from what's happening in Brazil and what's happening, and how we can be in conversation. So.
And we have a lot of people, so let's go ahead and go to the next person.
Hi, I have a yes and no question and then a question. The yes and no question is, do you have a Republican mayor?
Not yet. We are trying to make it more bipartisan, but also beyond that, like trying to get rural cities as well. And I think that's really important. A lot of the pilots are kind of in, city centers or surrounding city centers. And I think it really is important for research, for narrative purposes, particularly because I think, if there are minds and hearts we have to change, it might be in those rural areas or in conservative-led jurisdictions.
And the question I have about the grassroots work is, you're talking about mobilizing people to produce narratives to change minds. There's another element to getting policy passed, and that's inundating legislators with letters or whatever is, and training people to be good citizens, empowering them to be part of something bigger than just their personal narratives about how this affects them. Because you're packaging that and hoping to change people's minds, and that is very, very precarious work. It takes an awful long time. But if the same people, instead of telling their stories, are constantly harassing their legislators, right? In a very easy way nowadays, if it's part of their regular lives to do that, and constantly drip, 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 I think that would be very powerful. And I think that is something that you should consider.
Awesome. Thank you, Giselle.
Thank you.
There wasn't a question, but I'm glad that you let it. I love it.
But I will say it is important to kind of sit narrative within advocacy work. And I think, Madeline, you mentioned like C4 involvement. Like we do actually need like lobbyists who can advocate for guaranteed income and actually make it a kind of civic engagement thing beyond just storytelling.
But I think the one really amazing piece of what Giselle was just saying is that when you do grassroots work where people are going to come in with their torches and whatever to the, well, actually, hopefully not that. Walk that back. When people want to come and bang their pots and pans, and the legislators' offices and make this their issue, what happens is a really important dialogue between, grassroots movements leaders and, researchers, which is we understand better what the demand of folks on the ground is that might be a little bit different from the demand that we find that's research driven, which was true for One Fair Wage. They started out, organizing Tipton restaurant workers saying, hey, we'd like to raise the sub-minimum wage for Tipton service workers. Tipton service workers said, no, we'd like to abolish the sub-minimum wage. Yeah. So the demand changed through the organizing work, and that became a really powerful way to really build the movement to be driven by the grassroots directly.
Nice, love it. When you ask a question, I just realized, can you say your name, and if you're with an organization or like kind of include that, but if you're not with an organization, that's cool too. But just so that we kind of have a sense of who's in the room.
Sure. I'm Lee Stevens, and I'm here from Calgary, Alberta, representing Basic Income Alberta.
Woohoo!
Canada. And my question is for Madeline. Can you expand on the impacts of the Stockton experiment and the Magnolia's Mothers Trust, specific to its impact on work and labor, because that is the biggest reason for opposition to BI?
Yeah, so with the income maintenance experiments of the 60s and 70s, the only thing that the researchers were looking at was what was the impact. So it was this assumption, which I think all researchers make. I say that's not a researcher, so I'm sorry, friends. But the assumption they went in was like, oh, of course, giving people money will impact the labor market. So let's see what the impact is. And I think one of the really important things about SEED and Magnolia Mothers Trust and the other demonstrations now is that we have a much broader understanding of what makes a healthy community. It's not just is everybody working, but it's also what are the health benefits? What are the impact on stress levels? But yes, people always want to know what are the impacts on the labor market, which, as Halah said, we actually have data. We know this. We know that there are slight reductions for two communities. One that is recently birthing parents. So women who have children tend to take a little bit more time home to care for their child and don't immediately go back into the labor market, which I think most of us would say is a net good for society. Babies thriving, even if you want to say you're just making little workers, important. The other, sorry, this is definitely not the narrative that Halah wanted me to be pushing. The second is that young men tend to delay their entrance into the labor market. Again, the assumption is that they're staying in for more education, which again, I think we see as a net good, right? So what Stockton found, and the first year of data is out, the second year is not out yet, was that people who received the guaranteed income were much more likely to have full-time employment. And I believe it was higher wage employment, but I can't be certain of that, after 1 year of receiving that. We've also seen in Magnolia Mothers Trust that the moms are able to do things that help move them up the economic ladder, like complete education or take additional classes to find better jobs. So having an economic cushion actually allows folks to take risks that lead to better payoff. I think for many of the folks in the room or online, we have been able to invest to get where we are. I was able to go to school to get where that investment helps you move up. And so we definitely are seeing that. I think there's gender differences that we need to think about and talk about. And I hope that some of the research coming out will really explore what that means, who's able to take those opportunities. Does that answer? Was that what you were looking for?
Absolutely, yeah. Thank you so much.
And Catherine, do you want to add anything as from Mayors for Guaranteed Income, since SEED was kind of the inaugural? Is there anything else that you want to add around labor side of things?
Yeah, so in terms of SEED's first year findings, again, this is pre-COVID findings, but yeah, so in terms of working, the participants in the treatment group were able to find more permanent work at twice the rate of those in the control group. So showing that, as Madeline was just speaking about, that when you have, extra cash, that you're able to maybe take some time off from your temporary job to maybe go to an interview for a full-time job, or take some time off to do self-enhancement, whether that means more education or more training, to then be more competitive for permanent employment.
I want to plug one other thing, which is prior to SEED, there's the work of Ioana Marinescu, who I know is speaking on a session in this conference, and Evelyn Forge, who you mentioned, looking at basic income or cash assistance programs internationally, and found, and especially Ioana Marinescu looking at Alaska Permanent Fund dividend, the evidence is pretty clear. People largely keep their jobs, and for a very small percentage, they might reduce hours, but they spend it, taking care of their newborn child, or I needed to take off a few hours to prepare for an interview so I can get a better job. Or over the long term, which is a lot harder to record, they take off time to go back to school. And then you need to, if you're trying to look at those effects, you have to look at them over a much longer period of time. So it's important to recognize the existing research on that is really clear.
Mm-hmm. And also just goes to this idea of the excitement around more people and longer demonstrations to be able to understand, 1 year you might not really be able to see the bigger picture of long-term impact. Yeah,
absolutely.
Michael Lewis. I teach at Hunter College in New York, but I'm not representing it. I teach there. I have a question about how advocates and researchers work together. Because it seems to me that researchers are often social scientists, not always, but often social scientists. And researchers are trying to answer questions about different things, impacts on well-being, labor supply, inflation, things like that. They have questions they're trying to answer, whereas advocates are they're trying to actually affect change. And those two things can be in tension. They don't have to be, but they can be. So I have a question, how do advocates and researchers who do have different goals, even researchers who are supporters, how do they work together? How do you do that?
It's a great question. I would say some of the goals in social science research are really specific, and to be honest, very few people want to hear about them. The specific, the marginal propensity to consume from your stimulus check after you've paid all your debts down and all your bills. So there are certain questions that we don't focus on. They sit in the study. They're super important. They're super important over the long term for building social science literature. And then there are questions that, research is not, I'd love to say that it's this unbiased discipline, but there are a lot of assumptions inherent to the questions that you ask as researchers. And I think one of the things that you can gain from conversations with advocates in a pipeline between research and advocacy is to inform, wait a minute, my question is really leading. Or, what are the impacts that we didn't even think to measure for, around mental health, or how, if we want to long-term create research that can inform a cost-benefit analysis, which would require, informing, getting really technical here, the appropriate discount rate for funds that you put in to a policy over time and the benefit that's accrued. How are you going to measure that benefit? Well, advocates can tell you, you have to measure a lot more than just whether or not they're keeping their job and their income level. You have to measure what is the long-term impact of, them being able to care for their child and their child being, okay, let's call it more productive as an adult. I don't like that framing for narrative work, but in terms of when you're doing policy work that's driven by econometric analyses and cost-benefit analysis, you can actually benefit from the perspectives of advocates who say there's a lot more that impacts than you're measuring when you think about how the community overall is thriving. A really good, interesting example, one of the few studies that did this, in Kenya, there's this large-scale implementation of a cash transfer program, and what they found is that there were positive benefits, not just on the recipients, but major, measurable, significant, statistically significant spillover effects on the community of folks who didn't get the basic income. And part of that also has to do with how the guaranteed income was framed as a community empowerment initiative. So people thought of it, how am I going to spend this money? How am I going to, so there's a lot of intersection, how you frame things in research, how you approach a problem, what questions you're asking, they all add up together. So I hope that answers the question, but it's an ongoing conversation.
The only thing I would add to that is I see myself also as a translator, being able to take really what can be technical or opaque language and bring it out to a wider audience. And so being in conversation with researchers, I'm like, wait, do I fully understand this? So what you're actually trying to say in like layman's terms is blah, blah, blah. So there was the great study that came out recently around the racial wealth gap and kind of what it will take to close it. And I was reading it and it's lovely. And then it gets all mathematical and bananas, right? And so I think my job is to kind of continue to take that and talk about it in ways that doesn't lose some of the audience like myself who is not technically inclined.
Right. And I think last example of that is in climate change work. For decades, climate scientists were trying to describe in many, many complicated terms the effects that they were seeing over a long term. That doesn't help us understand that the extreme weather events on a regular basis are linked to climate change. So you need folks working directly in conversation to understand how to do policy communications from research.
Nice. And we have time. I just want to we have time for 2 more questions. So just a heads up.
Joshua Miller, from New York. I'm a student at the University of Chicago, though I'm not here on behalf of them. I'm here on behalf of the UVI Center. So my question is about the relationship between pilots and modeling. And obviously modeling is going to be part of the research equation, a pretty significant part of the research equation for UBI. So my question is, CBO, Penn Wharton, they have a lot of the parameters we use in modeling already for terms of, the stuff you'd answer about UBI. What additional parameters are we looking to research using the oncoming and current pilots? What more additional pieces of data that we really want or need to help us answer further questions about UBI?
Nice.
Try to answer this really quickly, which is to say, some of the existing macro modeling work has been useful to sort of, we did a study, we call it UBI in the city, that took a look at what it would mean, modeled out in macro modeling terms, what it would look like to implement a guaranteed income in New York City and where the effects would be. But a lot of macro modeling to date is a little bit limited when it comes to measuring a lot of behavioral variety. There's a lot of choices that a macroeconomist makes when they're building a model that is inherent to assumptions about the world as it is. So what we're doing at JFI is we're trying to venture forth into the worlds of heterogeneous agent models, HANC models, which Claudia Sam, who's another speaker on in this conference, will be talking a little bit about. But basically, we need better macro models for the kind of research you're talking about that are much more informed by longer timelines and some of the behavioral impacts in individual level to understand the society-wide impacts absent of having a guaranteed income across the country that we can study. So short, as best as I can answer without getting too complicated.
Catherine, did you want to add anything? Like what, in your guys' minds, like where the gaps in the data are?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of like the parameters of pilots, I mean, MGI takes a position of like communities lead that, and they do pilots based on, what they think their communities need. And so, for example, just in terms of like cadence of, the payments, if you're doing refugees or returning citizens, a monthly payment may not necessarily work. You may want to do a lump sum for the first 3 months because they're transitioning to something they might need more, but really taking the context of people's situation and who that guaranteed income is serving. But I can't talk about modeling in the way that Halah just talked about because that's beyond me, but just thinking about like the kind of decision that cities make to think about how they're going to design their pilots.
Awesome. Okay, one last question.
I have a follow-up question to one of the conversations that, or you guys have been having, but Carl from Qatar, I think that's how you say it. Is that how you say it? Okay. As the panelist is right that some questions are leading, but aren't you all accepting the leading questions of UBI opponents by assuming that it's a bad thing when people without children don't work? Shouldn't we accept the fact that low-wage jobs are terrible and show that it's a good thing when UBI empowers people to turn them down?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of narrative work is exactly that, right? Like, you're not just talking about guaranteed income anymore. Like I mentioned earlier, it's existential. You're changing the way that people define work, right? There's a great book by Graeber called like Shit Jobs or something.
Bullshit jobs.
Which is like, if they're meaningless, of course you should leave them. And I mean, the whole thing about the Great Resignation during, these times is that like people understand that their essential job was underpaid and they were being put in really precarious situations. And of course they don't want that anymore, right? So you're absolutely right. If we have a chance, and that's what basic income is saying, it's saying like, if you have a chance to give up your shitty job so you can get something that's more meaningful, then great. But it's also acknowledging that some jobs don't give you money. And I think it's really challenging the notion of work. I think we conflate work with wage labor. And narrative income is saying we need to kind of to challenge that. We need to kind of say some jobs maybe don't get wages. If you're an artist, it's your income is volatile. If you're a student, you're not getting a wage. If you're a caregiver, you're not getting a wage. But are those important work? Absolutely. But yeah, and I think you're kind of on the point in terms of like how guaranteed income can challenge narratives beyond cash assistance, right?
Plus. I got nothing to add. I think that's right on.
Awesome. Okay, wonderful. Well, we are coming to the end of our time together. Let's first just give a round of applause to Madeline and Halah and Catherine.